The Writer's Afterlife is about a writer who's a passionate writer. Tom Chillo has dedicated his life to writing. He writes plays, he writes novels, he writes movies, he writes TV. Occasionally he takes movie jobs to pay for the time he's going to need to write what he really wants to write, his novels. He's written 2 novels that got great reviews, has plays done, and as one day as he's sitting in front of his computer in his boxer shorts, rewriting his screenplay, he has a heart attack and dies. He quickly sees his life as a movie trailer. His father has Alzheimer's, so he doesn't come. His mother had died already. His longtime girlfriend is really the only one at his grave. His agent really didn't have time to come. And then eventually he finds himself in this very odd place, greeted by a guide named Joe. And Joe introduces him to the Writer's Afterlife. So Tom learns a few things. First, time in the Writer's Afterlife is very different from time on Earth. It has no exact purpose. And night seems to change to day as if by whim. The days and nights are splendid. The breeze is cool, and the sun shines with warmth without ever getting hot. In the evening, the moon is white and magnificent, and the stars gleam through wisps of clouds. After a short while, I realized that each individual writer creates the exterior landscape he or she is imagining. If you think night, it's night. If you think of a city, there it is. The afterlife is truly fueled by each writer's imagination. So one quiet night, Joel tells me a little about himself. He had been a painter born in Florence in 1578 and had wanted to be famous like Michelangelo. He made his way to Rome where he found nothing but indifference to his work. He sold a few paintings, but nothing nearly enough to pay for the roof over his head. So after several years, he gave up, married a farmer's daughter, and moved to a small farm north of Rome, where he toiled until his death from plague when he was only 44. You want to be famous? Like hundreds of painters and sculptors who entered Rome's barred gates every year, I wanted to be Michelangelo. I burned with the need for fame. I dreamt of being the stuff of legend. And it didn't happen? Did you ever hear of the great painter Gianni Palminteri Giuliano? And that was why Joe had been assigned me. He was a good painter, but never famous on earth. And we also died at the same age. So whoever did the assigning, and that was never really brought up, Joe and I would be a good match. Joel told me not to think about his life told me he tried not to think about his life on earth, and he tried not to talk about it. He told me that he felt an overwhelming sadness, and that many of those who had just missed out on being famous were eventually asked to be afterlife tour guides. Each one was given an artist who had just missed being famous and had been the same age at the time of death. Tour guides eased their charges into their particular afterlives, just as Joe was doing for me. He told me that I'd probably be assigned an actor, or perhaps a composer, but certainly not a writer. That was how it worked. You guided someone you couldn't compete with, but had empathy for. He told me that in time I'd get used to the existence in the writer's afterlife. The good news was I was never going to get a cold or flu. I'd never get a pimple. I'd never have a sexual desire or the need to be romantically in love. How about the urge to write, I asked. Gone for all eternity, he said, smiling widely. That notion bothered me for a moment, but then a slight twinge of sorrow passed. I had written my entire life. I didn't have much memory of ever not being a writer. It was going to be weird not getting up and planning my day around writing something. We walked a few more minutes or weeks. I had no notion how long our walk actually took when I saw a woman in the distance. She stood on a hill in the wind, and the sky above her was a dark, brooding wilderness. Her long, dark hair flew wildly over her shoulder, and she was wearing clothing that made her look like a poor woman from the mid-19th century. The closer we got, the more I could see. Now there was drizzling rain. The landscape around her looked like a moor, the kind of moor you find in England of weather. stopped. Emily Bronte? Excellent. You know your writers, Joe. She's one of the Eternals I wanted you to meet. Can I meet her? Go ahead. Go over to her, he told me. I walked ahead and suddenly I was in her world. I was on the hill feeling the drizzle on my face. I felt the wind blowing and watched her standing there looking off into the distance. As I drew closer, I noticed an aura around her. She was radiant, a contrast to the gloomy landscape surrounding her. I edged up to her from the side and saw that even though she was alone, she didn't look lonely. I felt that despite her large, dark, and sad eyes, she was exuding warmth and contentment. Her long-sleeved, light blue dress covered her from her neck to her ankles. She turned to me, and without smiling, she said, "Thank you so much." "For what?" "For reading me." "It was my pleasure, Miss Bronte," I said. "Call me Emily." She replied, "Barely 30 years old and immortal." Then she turned away from me and smiled to a figure of a man, a shadow walking out of the mist of the moor, depicting her sexual longing. He was handsome with longish hair blowing in the same breeze, wet from the same drizzle falling, and he had the same sparkle in his eyes that she had. It was Heathcliff. I stepped back. They embraced. I turned and caught a glimpse of Joe, who was standing in a streak of light that separated the moor from where I had previously been. Joe nodded to me. I understood. I got it. Emily Bronte would live through eternity with the perfect male of her own creation. She and Heathcliff would be romantic lovers as long as there was a thing called time. I walked back to Joe. "So that's her joy, that's her reward," I told him. He nodded. "Not far from here is Charlotte Bronte, who will be forever happy with her Rochester." I saw them suddenly. She was on a bench, knitting, and he was sitting at her side. There was an enormous mansion on a hill above them. Charlotte was Jane Eyre, and it was all beginning to make sense. Joe urged me to follow him. "There are more writers for you to meet. Let's meet the others. The other Eternals."